Good morning and welcome to CHIPS, China and Taiwan Security, a report from the field. This webinar is going to be a discussion of some of our initial impressions following an extended and comprehensive week-long visit to Taiwan in late August of this year. The delegation was organized and led by the Hoover Institution, but was a partnership with the Asia Society in New York and the Freeman Spogli Institute here on the Stanford campus. Joining me for today's discussion are fellow travelers Larry Diamond, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, the Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and a Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education at Stanford University. He's also a professor by courtesy of Political Science and Sociology at Stanford and leads the Hoover Institution's programs on China's global sharp power and on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. Orville Schell is with us, a uniquely experienced China hand. He's the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York, a former professor and a dean at the University of California, Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. Next will be Oriana Schuyler Mascro, a center fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, where her research focuses on Chinese military and security policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, war termination, nuclear dynamics, and coercive diplomacy. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And finally, Matt Turpin, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, specializing in U.S. policy towards the People's Republic of China, economic statecraft, and technology innovation. He is also a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies. And from 2018 to 2019, Matt served as the U.S. National Security Council's Director for China and the Senior Advisor on China to the Secretary of Commerce. In these roles, he was responsible for managing the interagency effort to develop and implement U.S. government policies on the People's Republic of China. Welcome, colleagues. Before we begin the conversation amongst ourselves and with all of you that are joining us from outside, I'd like to sketch some background for our recently completed trip. We began the effort to schedule a comprehensive visit over 2 years ago. It was repeatedly delayed by COVID restrictions and finally scheduled in August, only to find that we were to arrive just after the surprise visit of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. It was actually very good timing, as you might expect, because a number of issues were fresh in both local and global commentary as a result of the aggressive actions taken by the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in response to the Pelosi visit. It was an extensive visit, and because of long-standing Hoover involvement with Taiwan through the Project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region, we were given, I must say, privileged status and full access. The still extant COVID restrictions, while preventing some cultural exploration, did not meaningfully affect our interactions. That access led to 30 meetings in 5 days on the island, including a formal public meeting in the presidential office, fully covered by media, with President Tsai, that led to a follow-on private session. Later in the week, several of us were invited to a private dinner with the president and her national security team in her home. We had individual meetings with every member of her cabinet, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the National Security Advisor and his deputy, the head of national intelligence, the Mainland Affairs Council in charge of cross-strait relations, and the economic minister, among others. We also met with members and leaders of the opposition party, the KMT, as well as newly created so-called centrist party, the TPP, members of the Taiwanese Legislative Yuan or Parliament, and even a local mayor. On the commercial side, we met with current and former industry leaders, including the chairman of TSMC and 2 other semiconductor companies. On the diplomatic side, we also had a session with the leadership team at the American Institute on Taiwan, the representative of the United States interests on the island. The length of our visit was both unique and beneficial. We were able to interact with many key stakeholders in the future of Taiwan, and by having similar conversations with each, get a triangulated better sense of the larger Taiwanese perspectives on critical issues that a shorter conversation with just a few interlocutors would perhaps not have provided. Before turning to my assembled colleagues, I have 3 takeaways from this, my first visit to Taiwan in over 40 years. First, despite some perceptions, Taiwan is not passive in its relationship with the People's Republic of China. They have a clear policy and guidelines publicly released and popularly endorsed that the Tsai administration follows in attempting to shape cross-strait dialogues and relations. Known as the Four Commitments, they are very simply and alliteratively peace, parity, democracy, and dialogue. Peace means that Beijing must renounce the use of force against Taiwan. Parity requires that neither side of the Taiwan Strait should deny the other's existence. Democracy means that Taiwan's future must be decided by its 23 million people. And finally, dialogue that means that both sides must be able to sit down for talks without preconditions. The Taiwanese government has been remarkably consistent in adhering to those tenets. My second takeaway, shared by some but not all of my colleagues, is that Beijing has executed a fundamental shift in policy. For decades, their goal was to deter Taiwanese independence. It seems their policies now is to compel reunification with Taiwan on the party's timeline. This may sound like a subtle shift, but it is very significant. It means that the Chinese Communist Party is no longer satisfied with what we have all long considered to be the status quo, and that Beijing is likely to increasingly employ active means to achieve its goal of complete annexation of the island. Finally, I think we all found President Tsai Ing-wen to be singularly impressive leader, threading her way through some very treacherous situations. And she's assembled an impressive team in whom she places great trust. She grasps the seriousness of the challenge Taiwan confronts and is trying to move the public toward a more robust and resilient response. Importantly, we were struck by her belief that what Taiwan most needs from the United States is a clear demonstration of commitment, independent of the rhetorical debate over strategic clarity or ambiguity. We gathered from our discussions that other governments and opinion leaders in the region may have a similar view. The predominant view among our delegation is that the U.S. should demonstrate this commitment through economic partnerships, expanded inclusion in international venues on the part of Taiwan, and of course, substantially accelerated deliveries of weapons and greater cooperation and training, intelligence sharing, and joint operations. I believe that this can be done without formally announcing a shift from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. Words are important, but actions speak louder than words. I'd now like to turn to my colleague, Larry Diamond, for his introductory comments before taking questions and answers from all of you.
Thank you, Jim, for those great summary views. I think very apt and eloquent of what we came away with. Let me first add to the background by saying that a major motive for our trip was deepening concern about the growing PRC danger to Taiwan, both because of the shift that Jim just spoke about in terms of a more active or aggressive mentality toward compelling unification, and also because of the really rapid deterioration of the military balance between the mainland and Taiwan in favor, of course, a massive PRC advantage. And this has come on top of many concerns about not only Taiwan's technical and hardware military strength and readiness, but also the will to fight on the part of the population. And that's one of the things we wanted to explore while we were there. Military readiness, military strategy, and societal will to resist PRC aggression and intimidation. There were four very profound shocks in advance of our visit that I think have helped to shape Taiwan public opinion and the way that political leaders, beginning with Tsai Ing-wen, are trying to respond to and further crystallize Taiwan public opinion. To my thinking, these were the demise and destruction by the PRC, absolute and final destruction of Hong Kong's autonomy and partial democracy under the pledge from the handover from British rule in 1997 of one country, two systems, and really the betrayal of Beijing's commitment to respect Hong Kong's autonomy under one country, two systems, which of course is, in maybe modified terms, the deal on offer to Taiwan. So if that has been destroyed and very rapidly undermined in Hong Kong, why would the people of Taiwan invest any credibility in it? The second, which has been going on for a while and getting steadily worse, has been the growing pace and increasingly aggressive character of PRC military incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which has, I think, the intent of really wearing down and psychologically, if not operationally, punishing Taiwan and its military and deepening incursions into Taiwan's territorial waters. The third is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think has really woken up the Taiwan population to how sudden and overwhelming a challenge they may face militarily. And then the fourth was not just the encouragement and pride that the Taiwan society and political system drew from Speaker Pelosi's visit, but also the further intimidation and effort to demonstrate PRC military capability and intent by its very extensive and disrupting military exercises in the wake of the Pelosi visit. So 4 shocks, some of them very concrete things that have just happened this year or in recent years. We were very pleased to see what we saw. I think I can speak for the group as growing Taiwan resolve to do the things that need to be done to deter Beijing and to defend Taiwan. These include increased military spending, which has steadily risen from 1.7% of GDP to well over 2%. I think it's now up to 2.4% of GDP and may be set to rise further. Increasing civilian mobilization and readiness with very serious consideration underway now in Taiwan of increasing mandatory military service from 4 months, which is what it has been shrunk to, which is largely regarded as summer camp, to a year of very serious military service and training for all service age men in Taiwan. And it's possible that this shift, which has very substantial support in Taiwan's public opinion, could be announced, fairly soon. Then I think we were all struck by the need, if I can echo President Zelensky in the Ukraine crisis when he said, "I don't need a ride, I need weapons." Taiwan needs weapons, and it needs not only to have them promised and sold, it needs to have them delivered. And the 2 key takeaways I came away with, not having the expertise of in this realm of particularly Admiral Jim Ellis, who did not get an introduction, but who I will say to our audience led the aircraft carrier battle group response to the Taiwan crisis in 1996 and was at least in the region and in command during that very fateful and testing moment. So I think came up to speed with the following 2 convictions. One, following on the excellent article that Admiral Ellis and our colleague Jim Timby wrote last year in the Texas, I think, Security Review, we do need to see Taiwan and encourage Taiwan to move more to a porcupine strategy of resistance and military preparation. Lots of distributed, mobile, lethal, smaller weapons systems that can deter and, if necessary, repel a PRC invasion. But this is going to require the delivery of a lot of weapons systems that are maybe in the pipeline, but have not been delivered yet or are only being discussed. And it can't just be limited to those small and mobile systems. So we have hard work to do to rethink our own weapons procurement and production. And I would personally favor licensing the production of at least a few of these weapons in Taiwan. Two final points. The American government, the US government, must not only signal to the people of Taiwan, as President Biden has done to do, its readiness to stand with Taiwan if it is attacked without Taiwan abandoning the four commitments that President Tsai has spoken, that Jim Ellis spoke of, that President Tsai declared. We also need to see our government prepare the American people for what lays ahead, so that they are ready to support what could be a very substantial military intervention and a very deeply and shockingly costly one if it comes to it. Our deterrence will be more effective if we do that. And Japan needs to do the same thing. I'll just close by echoing Jim in a different way, quoting Teddy Roosevelt: "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." And we need to get a much bigger stick in the hands of the people of Taiwan and to deploy it ourselves to the region.
Thank you, Larry. Now I'd like to turn to Orville Schell, as I mentioned, a renowned expert in our interactions with China over many decades. Orville, what were your perceptions of our visit?
Well, thanks, Jim. It's nice to be here to sort of ruminate on the significance of our trip. You know, I had a profound sense upon arriving and in the 6 days we were there that we were sort of present at a really important inflection point. And I think since then, that impression has only been confirmed. And what I mean to say is we've been through recently a very important transition from engagement. Some people called it competition, but competition pales off into the possibility of conflict, from bridge building to decoupling. And from, I would say, a emphasis on sort of friendly relations to relations that sadly are increasingly hostile. And I think in a certain way, even though Speaker Pelosi's trip, many people suggested that it was a kind of provocation. I think I had some sense of that before we went. Once we got there, I felt more and more that it was what China did by way of response was in the playbook and was just waiting for the right moment to be executed, namely the 6 live fire military exercises all around the island. And I think I also felt that her trip didn't really precipitate the inflection point, but marked it. And it also had an incredibly important role that I think Larry alluded to. It began to wake Taiwan itself up, as well as I think many other people around the world, to recognize that we are at a dividing line. And this is what Xi Jinping has in mind if push comes to shove in the region. It was with a certain, I think, triste sense that I arrived in Taiwan I first started there way back in the 60s when things were extremely hostile between Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, and the mainland, and Mao Zedong. And yet we'd had this amazingly hopeful interlude where 9 US presidential administrations all backed engagement. And it did create a kind of a stability and a status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And that, I'm afraid now, sadly, is gone. And it is gone because of the increasingly belligerent posture that Xi Jinping has taken towards all of the pieces of errant Chinese real estate that it considers its own, and that his rejuvenation requires him to regain. So it's sort of as I say, rather sad and shocking to find ourselves back in the same state of adversity in which at least I began my career. So what's the remedy? What was our takeaways? I think Larry and Jim have given you a really good sense of that sort of bouquet. But one thing that just jumped out for me was that I think the most important thing the United States, allies, partners, and friends can do is to try and confect a multilateral assistance program for Taiwan in terms of deterrence. Because if we want to avoid conflict, it seems to me the challenge is this, and I think conflict would be devastating. It would be the Ukraine redux to the 10th power in Asia. And that is that we insofar as we can, Taiwan should be made as indigestible to the PRC as possible. That's the lesson of the Ukraine. And I think there are many other lessons which we should learn and we must learn of how to prepare to prevent a great power such as Russia or China for acting militarily. In other words, to make them realize that it is folly to sort of light the match. And as Mao Zedong once said, to, in effect, light the prairie fire. Taiwan has one great asset, and this is something that we are working on in this Hoover Asia Society project, and that is microprocessors. And as many of you know, Taiwan has TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, that makes 92% of all of the leading edge chips and over 50% of its legacy chips. And the world runs on chips. And the recent Commerce Department, which maybe Matt Turpin will talk a little bit about, regulations and export controls, that is a very important but incredibly complicated step forward. So I think what we have on our plates in front of us is how best to play these assets, how best in a way that's not provocative and doesn't completely abrogate the notion of strategic ambiguity. How do we support Taiwan, not just because Taiwan deserves support, but because we do not want to see Asia descend into the kind of a chaotic crisis that we now find Russia having inflicted on the Ukraine and Europe. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Orville. Excellent comments as always. Oriana, you've spent a career, actually 2 careers, your academic career and your military career, from a strategic to a tactical level, looking at national security issues affecting Taiwan and its relationship with the PRC. Was there anything on this trip that surprised you, or did it reaffirm things that you already believed and have articulated so eloquently over the years?
Well, thank you for teeing that up. I think a lot of the comments that I would have made about Taiwan's defense and the deterrent across the strait have been made by my colleagues previously. So I'm just going to add a few points to it. This is an obvious point, but this is a really difficult problem. And I think what happens what we learned and when we talked about, what Taiwan can do, what the United States can do, what the region can do, is explicitly or implicitly, there were a lot of trade-offs. involved, in which some things would lead to good effects on one hand and bad effects on the other hand. And what we're constantly trying to do in terms of deterring this conflict from happening is creating a cost-benefit calculus for Beijing that makes Xi Jinping think it's not worth it. Not only that the benefit of gaining Taiwan wouldn't be worth it, but also the costs would be high. But at the same time, that can be a very difficult thing to maintain. And so in a lot of cases, at least what I can do and what I can think of in our discussions with some of our colleagues were things that push this down the line. But I think there's a few truths that came out very strongly in our conversations. The first is no one has thought of a way to solve this problem, right? It's not like that we can come up with certain policy recommendations, whether they be for the United States or Taiwan, and then we can sit back and be like, now we're never going to have war over the Taiwan Strait. We can sit back, we can relax and move on with our day. The bottom line is, even if Taiwan, for example, was able to make significant changes in self-defense, and I'm with Larry, I was heartened to hear some of those changes that they had posited. For the first time, they seem acceptant of an idea that they needed more asymmetric systems. Their military doctrine, they told us, was also going to include urban warfare to prepare for a situation in which the PLA would actually get a beachhead, which was also very domestically sensitive. A lot of these things on the surface, you think they're very easy military solutions, but domestically, if you're saying, let's prepare to fight the PLA here on the island of Taiwan, the government is admitting that the PLA might be able to gain a beachhead. And domestically, that was difficult for a long period of time to admit. The preference, and it was expressed to us that the preference is still there by some people, potentially in the defense establishment, would be to have longer range precision munitions such that they could strike, the PRC import before they came across the strait. Obviously, for US purposes, given these sort of trade-offs, that's something that's a bit too escalatory for us. But all of these things, the bottom line is China is a country that has a lot of resources. When deterrence works against great powers, it only works temporarily, because they're going to cut whatever we do. And I do think we should do all these things, whether it is put intermediate range ballistic missiles in the second island chain to be able to saturate the strait, to give Taiwan the training and equipment they need to be able to at least hold off long enough for the United States to get there, to credibly commit that the United States is going to fight. All of those things, if they impose any caution on Xi Jinping, if they make him think, at least on the military side, that maybe this campaign won't be easy, it's not like the Chinese then give up. They go back to the drawing board and they figure out, okay, given that we now have, ideally in my scenario, these missiles that could saturate the strait, or even if the United States was able to get Japan on board to commit to the defense of Taiwan, which is, very hard to do given that their constitution prohibits it. But even if that happened, the Chinese would then go back to the drawing board and say, okay, given that we'll have to fight the United States and Japan, how do we still win this war? So the first point and takeaway, I think that was at least implicit in all of our conversations, is that the difficulty of this scenario is not new for Taiwan, though it is more acute now, and it's never going to go away, right? So there's always these trade-offs, and it's much more the case now between that near-term readiness and the long-term readiness. And you have to make those trade-offs between, okay, maybe it'd be really good to do something right now to prepare for defense because we are in this window. And our Taiwan colleagues agreed. Most of them did say that they thought the likelihood that China would invade, like physically try to do an amphibious assault between 2025 and 2027 was more likely than not. That was something new. And I think it's important to point out that there does seem to be a disparity between the elites of Taiwan that we met with and the public, because we were also given briefings on public opinion trends over time, in which polls that are put out by Taipei University do say that the majority of the people of Taiwan believe that an attack by China is either somewhat or very unlikely. And even as we watched those military exercises and compared them to what happened in the 1990s, and they were much larger and more sophisticated, right? Instead of just a handful of missile tests like occurred in the 1990s, we saw missile tests that went over the island into Japan's EEZ. We saw, hundreds of aircraft, surface ships, submarines, everything involved. But it was conveyed to us in Taiwan that the average person in Taiwan the exercises had minimal impact psychologically, and that they didn't feel them, they didn't notice them, and they had sort of gotten used to this type of exercise. And so when I think of what Taiwan has to do, we were all on board, and our colleagues were in Taiwan as well about, buying the right equipment. But changing the mentality of societies takes a lot longer. And as Larry articulated, there were some concerns about the average person in Taiwan's willingness to fight. And I think I just want to be clear. I gave a talk recently at another university, and a student from Taiwan was kind of offended by that comment, that this would be similar in a lot of societies. The military of Taiwan would fight. And at least that's what was conveyed to us. And I believe that there is confidence among cabinet members that the 180,000 people in the military would fight. But the number one determinant about whether a normal person fights is whether or not they have training and equipment to mount any sort of defense. And the average person in Taiwan, Larry was talking about conscription and needing more realistic training for people in uniform. And that is correct, but there is no training for people out of uniform, and obviously no access to weapons. Like, people don't have guns in their home in Taiwan or something like that. In addition to the sort of morale issues, one thing that was discussed a bit, and we do focus a lot on that equipment, but I think the average American doesn't realize how minimal our military sort of organizational ties are to Taiwan because of its unique political status, how we don't have official relations with Taiwan. Any other ally like Korea that the United States is planning on fighting with, we have these large scale war games, some of which I've participated in that last weeks at a time. We have, joint C2, we develop enemy COAs together. We have integrated command structures. We don't have any of this with Taiwan. We are doing some training, want to do more training of the Taiwan military, but to a large degree, our militaries are separate. They're seen as like separate campaigns. Taiwan largely deals with what happens on the island of Taiwan. The US military will handle the air and sea component. But if we're dealing with the level of conflict that we're talking about, it really is important that there's much more integration of our militaries, and we are far from that. So in my mind, some of the surprises were their views of the PRC and how the elites really did think that an attack could happen, and they're taking that more seriously. And also some of the views about Xi Jinping himself, which it's a little bit of a diversion from our discussion of Taiwan, but given that the Party Congress is going on right now in Beijing, I think it's notable that a lot of our colleagues in Taiwan made 2 points about Xi Jinping that I hadn't heard before, at least that aren't common in the United States. And the first is that his aggressiveness on Taiwan is not wildly popular among the elites. In particular, it was conveyed to us that they had information that Xi Jinping wanted to do those missile tests in Japan's EEZ, and other members of the standing committee did not. That was new information for me. And secondly, the viewpoint that his position is not as solid as we think in the United States. Some people were predicting that he wouldn't even get this third term. Now I think the Party Congress is underway. That he would have to give up one of his titles, not that he would get thrown out completely. But I think at least in Taiwan, there was much more of a sense of a degree of factionalism or domestic turmoil in China about this Taiwan issue. While at least my viewpoint and others in the United States is that Xi Jinping, like was previously mentioned, kind of is running the show and will continue to run the show in the future. So there's just some initial thoughts. And the last thing about trade-offs I want to say, and some of my colleagues, we discussed this, we disagree. I wouldn't say strongly because I'm torn. People at the highest levels of the Taiwan government did say that US demonstrations of commitment they think will help the morale of the Taiwan people to fight. I am concerned that high demonstrations of commitment in many cases make it seem like the United States is being provocative as well as Beijing, and undermines our legitimacy with third parties in the region that could potentially reduce our military access in a conflict. And I'm also concerned that the more Beijing is convinced we will intervene, the more likely they are to do a first strike against US basing in the region, in particular against Japan, that would make it difficult for us to fight. This is a trade-off. I'm not sure which one wins the day, because we need Taiwan to hold out long enough for us to get there. So I need the morale of the people of Taiwan to be strong enough. But if the United States is attacked first, we have difficulty in defending. And so I'll just leave it with the fact that in all of these scenarios, there's an upside and there's a downside. There's no easy way forward, but much more so than previous trips I've been on, we seem to be on the same page with our colleagues in Taiwan.
Thanks, Oriana. Great perspectives. Matt, you are up. You've watched this problem from the uniform side with your military service, from the highest levels of policy action in the White House, national security team. You've seen the sanctions side of it. We've seen recent activity in that area. How would you relate what's happened over the last couple of months to some of the learnings and lessons from our travels to Taiwan?
Well, thanks, Admiral, and thanks to my colleagues. I completely agree with kind of all the remarks that have gone on. So maybe I'll make a couple of them, reiterate a couple of points, and kind of end with some, and then we'll go to questions. First, I would reiterate Admiral Ellis's sort of first comment, that it appears that Beijing has shifted its policy from deterring a formal declaration of independence by Taiwan to a policy of compelling unification on the party's own timeline. And I would point out to listeners that on Monday, when Secretary Blinken was at Stanford University, being in his remarks, he made almost the same points, right? He noticed that there's been a change in the approach from Beijing towards Taiwan in recent years. It seems that the party has made a fundamental decision that the status quo was no longer acceptable to Beijing, and that it was determined to pursue unification on a much faster timeline. And so I think, what we're seeing is a broad understanding across at least the US policy community that we've sort of moved out of a period of time in which largely our position was to sort of advocate for that status quo, to sort of sit on both sides of this argument. One, making it clear to Beijing that we didn't want them using force, but that we largely believed that internally Beijing simply wanted to deter a formal declaration of independence, was willing to push off into the far future the resolution of this problem and hope for peaceful unification to work out. And that at the same time, we'd be sending clear signals to Taipei that we didn't want them to provoke something to happen. And that we've now moved into a period of time in which it appears that Beijing is actively seeking to solve what they consider to be the Taiwan problem on their own timeline, right? Which begs, I think, from a US perspective, a re-examination of sort of what our approach should be and how we manage this. And I think one of the things that sort of struck me and what I've been sort of thinking about is this thought about how the concept of provocation plays out, right? So that the idea that the United States and third countries need to restrain themselves in their assistance to Taiwan for fear of provoking the war that we don't want to see, serves as a useful sort of check on us as Beijing seeks to further isolate Taiwan. And that fundamentally one of the ways in which we achieve deterrence is for Beijing to conclude that Taiwan is not isolated, that Taiwan is able to get support, and therefore that the cost of them initiating a conflict is far higher than what they would be able to do if Taiwan was isolated. And so I think it's requiring us to rethink maybe some of our approaches over the last few years on how we think about this problem. And I suspect that this is some of the things that are going through the minds of my successors that are now, sort of sitting at the National Security Council and across departments and agencies. The other point I'd make is around Taiwan semiconductor companies seem to be understanding that they're going to have to diversify away from the mainland. This reflects sort of a broader understanding that we're moving through a period of the rebalancing of globalization in different directions. And we're watching as Taiwanese companies, American companies, and others look for other alternatives. So I think that we're going to see and continue to see, and we certainly heard this from Taiwanese companies, that they are having to understand what exactly their vulnerabilities are and how they think about relationships with other markets. I don't think this is something that we heard much from Taiwanese companies in years past. And so it suggested to me that there is a change that's happening across the Taiwanese business community, and that is sinking into the Taiwanese public. But we have not yet seen the sort of full implications of this. So maybe I'll stop there and turn it back over for some questions.
Thanks, Matt. Great perspectives. And we do have a number of questions coming in. The first, as we might anticipate, and as Larry alluded to, deals with the reactions of both Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, or the Chinese Communist Party, whichever you prefer, to the Putin's invasion of Ukraine. What lessons tactically, strategically, politically might each side take away from that? Rather than a full description of both sides and all the complexities, I'll ask that maybe each of you take one or two. My first one on the Taiwanese reaction, I think it clearly convinced them that Hong Kong was not a one-off. You could make a case that the longstanding agreements that for ultimate transfer that were accelerated and inappropriately on the part of China and with the use of force, you could make a case, well, it kind of was didn't end the way we wanted it to, but we knew how it was going to end. The fact that one country has now invaded another in this era, when that was thought to be proscribed, I think convinced the Taiwanese very clearly that that this was a possibility, and as Oriana mentioned, in some cases they view it as a probability that it will be a challenge that they'll face sooner or later. On the PRC side, there's a spectrum of views on that, what lessons they learned. I think from a military standpoint, and I defer to Matt on this as well, I think Xi learned the lesson that if you're going to do it, go big. No creeping incrementalism, bring all the tools that you need. And so I think that's an important piece of it. On the tactical side, from the Taiwanese, I think they understand now the value of intelligence, a common operating picture, the ability to integrate and get targeting information and intelligence from other agencies, all of which are not fully developed in their relationship with the U.S. were some of the things they learned. But who else would like a stab at the lessons from Ukraine on the part of either the PRC or Taiwan? Larry or Matt, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly this concept of whether Beijing would have to go big or sort of the creeping incrementalism. I mean, I think this is probably party leaders. They're torn on this. I mean, they would want a situation in which there is sort of political instability. There's an ability to sort of make an argument that they're being invited in some sense, and that they are not providing the kind of action that would justify multiple other countries coming in and providing assistance, right? But but they're also stuck with the problem of kind of what they've seen unfold in Ukraine, which is that gives an opportunity, right? Sort of doing something that is not sort of fully thought through. And I think one of the lessons that we're sort of seeing out of Ukraine is that the assumption had been at the top is that they could mount this sort of lightning strike against Kyiv, decapitate the top of the government, and everything would fall into their lap. And they had not really prepared for what would be a full invasion. And obviously that proved to be unsuccessful. And so I think they're still stuck with that problem. I don't think Beijing has a good way out of that. I think the idea that they would conduct preemptive strikes against US, Japanese facilities in preparation changes the entire nature of what this conflict would unfold as, right? I mean, the idea that at the initial hours, Beijing, unprovoked, would conduct strikes against the United States and Japan turns this into not really a Taiwan Strait crisis. I mean, this is a much broader war. And that is probably not something that is particularly high on the minds of PLA generals and party leadership, that they're ready to go down that path. So I'm a little torn. I actually think our ability to sort of think through deterrence in that situation is actually fairly good. And we should be fairly confident that our actions in deterrence have been successful up to this point. And there's no reason to believe that would evaporate overnight.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn to the microchip issue, since that's a function or something that we're really researching heavily here at Hoover in our partnership with the Asia Society. Two questions. One talks about, do you think this is the sanctions or the decisions, the policy decisions of the last couple of weeks by the administration are in any way going to affect the Chinese timeline or views on that? I kind of think this is kind of related, Larry, to our Silicon Shield kind of conversations that we had in Taiwan. And secondly, how were those efforts influencing the perspective of the Taiwan semiconductor industry itself, TSMC and the like, and how are they're going to respond to these strictures that are now a matter of U.S. policy? So first Larry, and then perhaps Orville on that.
Okay, thanks, Jim. The extraordinary, unprecedented, and very far-reaching export controls that were declared, about a week or so ago, I think it's going to take a long time to understand their impact. And as our colleague Glenn Tiffert has been stressing to us, enforcement is going to be the key. We've got a lot of export controls that China has fairly deftly shredded and navigated around because we don't have sufficient capacity to enforce, and because they use extremely clever, agile methods of concealment and working through intermediaries to try and overcome and evade these sanctions. So if they're going to work, we're going to need a dramatic expansion of the personnel and capacity in the US government to enforce. I think, Jim, that it must be obvious, and go back to a point Oriana made about the military, that we are dealing with a relentlessly determined and adapting adversary. So they are now going to adapt and say, well, okay, we're being denied all of this equipment and all of these supplies. We've got to double down further, which they're already doing on their effort to develop this in terms of their internal innovation and capacity. And they will probably accelerate their effort to steal or otherwise covertly acquire the technology and to attract more and more people back, even at risk of their running afoul of the sanctions, to help them do that. I will only say two more things. One is that we must run faster. We can't just hide behind and relax behind these new, very robust measures to try and slow China's access to these technologies. If we don't innovate and produce more creatively, it's only a matter of time before China catches up. And secondly, that means we have to deepen our innovation and co-production relationships with TSMC and other Taiwan companies.
Orville, you have anything to add, perhaps in the direction of allies and partnerships in the region? That diversification that we're now requiring of TSMC and others in terms of fabs and the like, that doesn't necessarily play to their business model in a positive way. How do you see the collaboration with allies playing out, given your experience in the region in the semiconductor field?
Well, one thing that really has impressed me, not only while we were in Taiwan and talking with companies like TSMC, UMC, et cetera, I should also point out that there's some division there. You all note that the founder of UMC, which is another large microchip fabber in Taiwan, Robert Cao, who had renounced his Taiwan citizenship, gone to Korea over a dispute with the government, made millions on the mainland, has suddenly come back, taken his Taiwan identity card back, and contributed $100 million to train citizen warriors, including 300,000 sharpshooter snipers. Well, that's a corporate head for you. But it seems to me that the governments, both in Taiwan and the United States and elsewhere, what's really is essential is I'm not sure who's talking to these companies. I think they ought to, the Koreans and the Japanese and the Americans and the Taiwanese ought to get together with all these corporate heads and say, let's get on the same page here. Because the bitter reality is that the companies like Samsung and TSMC and Qualcomm, et cetera, Intel, they do have the China needle in their arm. They are selling substantial amounts of chips to China. Now, is that a good idea, given the way the worm is turned? That needs some real discussion. And I think there's a kind of a lack of communication here, because these companies are like countries. I mean, TSMC, the whole world depends on it. And its branches around the world are like embassies. And I think we do need to get, that's a role the United States as a leader, I think, could play.
Thanks. Oriana, I have a question for you that was submitted by one of our attendees, and it kind of gets back to where are we in this relationship with China? You have some contacts still, I believe, in mainland China and the like. The question, perhaps optimistically, it says, is it possible to get back to the hide and bide kind of approach on the part of the PRC once Xi Jinping gets his third term and no longer feels that he's in the campaign mode? Or do you think in some ways, and I'm mixing metaphors here, we've crossed the Rubicon and we can't ever walk that back, and that we have to deal with, as Larry noted, just the adversarial character, and hopefully it doesn't get into to active conflict? What's your perspective, and more importantly, what do you think the Chinese believe with regard to that relationship?
I don't think we can ever go back, but I don't think this is a Xi Jinping specific issue. Of course, he seems more risk acceptant than previous leaders, but he was also brought in for a reason. And that's that whether it was the Communist Party or the average person in China, they were kind of fed up with Hu Jintao, in their mind, being pushed around by foreigners. The hide and bide, and I'm working on a book right now about how China has built power over the past 25 years. You have different strategies when you are in a weaker resource position than when you can compete directly or outcompete, because you either have the experience or resources to do so. the bottom line is China and the United States have always had conflicting interests. I get frustrated with some of my colleagues who have been working on this longer than I have, who have often said, all you need is good diplomacy. Back in the day, the United States and China got along quite well, and we could convince China just with the power of our arguments to do what we wanted them to do. But that's not how I see the history of the 70s and 80s and 90s. I see a China who felt forced to do what the United States preferred, but during that whole period of time had their own ideas of what they wanted, right? And Taiwan is a perfect issue. Some people would say, why would China ever use force? Aren't the Chinese famous for long-term thinking? And the answer is yes, they are. They've waited 70, years, over 70 years, and they were patient to build the economic power, the economic ties, and the past 25 years building the military required to do this. And so I think it would be very difficult now to convince China that the interests that they have had for decades and decades, they should no longer have, and that they would be better off, doing what the United States wanted instead of what they want. That's how I sort of see the US strategy for decades, is convincing China it's better off to be number two. And that strategy was never going to work. So the big question is just moving into the future. Can we manage this relationship such that the United States can still protect its own interests while trying to avoid conflict at the same time? And I'll just sort of end on a positive note, which is at the very least, there is no hostility or animosity between the people of our country and China. As you mentioned, I still have a lot of contact. I have a call on Monday with some colleagues in Beijing, and second Beijing opens up again, I'd like to go over there. And so on the people to people side, there's just the understanding, things are a little rough because we want different things in the world, but it hasn't escalated to a sort of more visceral, emotional, or ideological conflict.
Thanks. Very, very helpful. Back to partners and allies. I think all of us have agreed, and that as Oriana just noted, if this comes to conflict, we're going to need allies in all of this. Japan, South Korea, perhaps others for basing support and logistics, even if it's not active conflict, even if it's countering blockades or other, in efforts to intimidate on the part of the PRC. Where are we in all of that? Is there a contrarian forces here in play? In other words, we want people to be on our side, but perhaps we're not offering the economic or security incentives that lead them to believe that they have an alternative to dealing effectively with China. It gets back to our scenario work we did in preparation for our semiconductor report. Are we now, instead of a bipolar world, back to a tripolar world in Asia, where there's the US, there's China, and then there's the non-aligned? Or what are your senses from the Asia Society on that?
Well, Jim, I think it's really interesting in a curious way. The answer to your question, I think the greatest catalytic agent towards bringing allies and partners and friends closer together has not been our own diplomatic skills. It's been China's belligerence. And I think why this is a rather frightening advantage that we suddenly find ourselves in possession of is that what it suggests is that Xi and China really have a kind of a very distorted or very diminished sense of their own agency and their own ability to change things. Now, Oriana, I take your point. They've gotten powerful. They're sick of biding and hiding. They're sick of being second fiddle, all of these things. But on the other hand, if you look at what Xi Jinping has been doing of late, I mean, who in the world alienates Sweden, Norway, Australia, Canada, and India? I mean, why do that? And there are many other things that within his own economy, within his own sort of portfolio of domestic issues, but certainly in terms of foreign policy, you'd have to say, yes, they have the power. Yes, they can bully people around, but why do it? How is it conceivably impossible in the interest of China's national security to do that? So something is amiss here. And I'll just end by saying, I think one of the pieces which we've had a devilishly difficult time understanding, much less analyzing because it's so mushy, and that is the psychological syndromes in which people like Xi Jinping, and I should say Putin as well, operate. And their thin skin, their face issues, their victim culture, their humiliation complexes, insecurities. I mean, one could go on, but that is absolutely important for us to understand in a much more sophisticated way than we do if we're trying to assess what's going to happen.
If I could build on that point that Orville made, I have to look at it as I'm actually quite amazed, given the economic position that the PRC has with so many of its neighbors. It's actually quite surprising that essentially all of them all want to continue to hedge away from Beijing, right? That they're all seeking out alternatives. They aren't necessarily bandwagoning with Beijing. They're looking for ways to find middle ground to stand in. And so, it should never be surprising to us that folks don't automatically ascribe to what the U.S. vision is, right? They've got their own ideas, they've got their own interests, but Beijing does provide incredible opportunity to be able to form those alternative coalitions in ways that had they executed these things much better, it would simply not be there for the United States or others.
Thanks, Matt. Very important. Larry, I'm going to end on a note that's familiar to you as one of the preeminent scholars of democracy in this nation and indeed the world. We've talked about it from a military perspective. We've talked about it from an economic perspective. What's your sense as you elevate it into the world of, in some cases, at least according to some pundits, a declining democracy? What do you think the role of this conflict or confrontation, at least over Taiwan, has in the greater scheme of the relationship of democracies around the world?
I think, Jim, thank you. That's an extremely important question that we haven't pondered enough. It's a major reason why Ukraine has elicited such broad American and European support, that it's not just an independent country that's being ravaged by an increasingly brutal and bullying Russian state. It's a democracy struggling to become a better, deeper, more rule of law respecting democracy. And so Ukraine has become a battleground between not just democracy and authoritarianism, but between democracy and authoritarian aggression, which, I mean, we have to use this analogy, which is bringing us back to the 1930s. And now we have to ask ourselves, what would happen to democracy in the world if the world's most powerful authoritarian regime, which China clearly now is, were able to invade and conquer one of the most dynamic, effective, successful, I think it all impressed us deeply on our trip, innovative and high quality democracies in the world. If you look at almost any of the indicators from Freedom House, The Economist intelligence unit, or wherever, the trends all show not only a resilience of Taiwan democracy, but a deepening of Taiwan democracy. And so if China was able to snuff that out through sheer brute force and conquest, I think the notion that they would stop there and be happy at having ended the century of humiliation and unified the country is preposterous. At that point, they would seek to push the United States out of Asia. They're already trying to flip all the Pacific Island states. We see what they're doing to try and dominate the South China Sea and make it a Chinese lake. And the long-term vision, in my view, is to make all of the rest of Asia, to one degree or another, vassal states or supplicant states, if not satellites of the Middle Kingdom. This, I think, is very important, this line of analysis, to persuading both the American public and, crucially, I cannot emphasize it enough, the Japanese public, that this is an existential issue for our national security and our freedom. It's not just about defending Taiwan because they're nice people and we don't like to see China bullying. It's really the kind of existential moment that I think Czechoslovakia was in the 1930s.
Well, thank you for that. And that's a powerful note on which to close. I want to thank all our attendees for their questions and for their participation. This is kind of a teaser of coming attractions. We've got a number of research papers and volumes coming out, not all of them directly related to our trip to Taiwan, but certainly informed by that. You have not met all of our fellow travelers. Those opportunities may be a part of future constructs as well. And I can assure you that we've learned a lot from this process, and we've learned a lot from your questions and conversations. So thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event hosted by the Hoover Institution with a focus on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much.